Okay, so this video is about the Lancet letter on the scientific consensus COVID-19 and the Jon Snow Memorandum. I've also included a cat in here because I'm hoping to hit another category of YouTube videos and make sure that this has something for everybody. So, we're at a point in the COVID-19 pandemic where we are entering the second wave of the pandemic that's already had 35 million cases worldwide and a million deaths worldwide. And one of the really troubling things for me and for a lot of other people has been how poorly the pandemic has been managed in several countries that have the resources, the infrastructure, and the expertise to have done much better. The UK and the US are two particularly salient examples, with over 57,000 and 200,000 deaths, respectively. Neither of these countries got their pandemic responses right with the first wave, and I'm going to talk more about the UK experience because that's literally closer to home. At the beginning, when this was a novel virus, we didn't know a lot about its particular properties. They always were the basic principles of infectious disease epidemiology and pandemic management that a lot of countries very actively adopted and very successfully. But we didn't seem to do that in the UK, we didn't do that in the US. We were quite slow to implement the necessary measures, we didn't really implement them completely, and we were quite quick to ease lockdown and try and get life moving again. We didn't successfully use lockdown to actually set up the necessary systems to allow us to control the pandemic, specifically our test, trace, and isolate system, which still isn't functional. We also didn't do enough to actually think about supporting people through lockdown, through restrictions, and all the other consequences of primarily the pandemic. As we've entered the second wave, we find ourselves in a position where we've not really used the last few months and the costs we've incurred over the last few months to actually make ourselves substantially better prepared for the arrival of the second wave. This has been a concern for many in the scientific community as to why knowing what needs to be done hasn't translated into doing it. And the reasons for this are complex, but not particularly opaque. The governments had to do something that perhaps governments aren't terribly optimized for these days, which is looking after the population. When we've got governments that are essentially optimized to essentially serve the interests of the rich, it is rather difficult for them to actually do the sort of things that require them to act like a government and look after the rest of the population. And needless to say, they've been very slow to do it. The point about resources is a particularly important one. We needed the resources to support people, to make provisions for all the changes to life that needed to be made for COVID-19, to set up a national test, trace, and isolate system. Yet we've had loads and loads of money that's gone towards private companies that are meant to deliver these services, that we actually had national health service systems in place that could have taken on the task quite easily with sufficient support, but that never really happened. So at this point in the pandemic, entering the second wave, here's what we know about COVID-19. It's a novel coronavirus. It's transmitted by contact, and it can also be transmitted via the airborne route, whereby the virus persists in aerosols in the air, which can travel several meters from the actual point of the infection. It's a serious illness. It's absolutely not like flu. The fatality is much higher. People can develop an extremely severe illness with it, even if they don't succumb to it. And it's become increasingly clear that a substantial proportion of the survivors continue to experience ongoing health ill effects, what we're now describing as long COVID. And remember, 7 months in, there's still a lot that we've got to learn about long COVID and how long it is, who's vulnerable to it. It's important also to remember that we don't actually have any effective treatments for the virus directly. And while there are lots of vaccines in development, as yet we don't actually have a working vaccine. However, we do know what works. Physical distancing works, mask use works, hand hygiene works, avoiding crowded spaces, avoiding poorly ventilated indoor spaces, minimizing the sizes of crowds. All these interventions work. Having a working test, trace, and isolation system works. You can detect outbreaks, you can move to control them, you can keep an eye on what's actually happening with the virus in your communities. Yet, we've been remarkably slow to adopt these measures, and many of them have become oddly politicized. Mask wearing is perhaps the starkest example of this. So, in recent months, we've particularly seen what seems like a concerted campaign to promote a very troubling and deeply flawed approach to managing the pandemic, what's widely described as the herd immunity strategy. The idea being that if you have enough people who are infected with the virus and develop immunity to the virus, you will ultimately achieve a degree of control. The argument goes, shield the vulnerable and let the rest of the population get back to life as normal, contract the infection, and let it rip. This is a deeply flawed idea for multiple reasons. It doesn't seem at the moment that we develop lasting immunity to COVID-19. Immunity seems to wane, and we're already seeing reports of people being reinfected, which is what happens with other seasonal coronaviruses. Even if we were able to acquire sufficient immunity through natural infection, the truth is there's no example to date of any infection being controlled by naturally acquired herd immunity without having an effective vaccine. But the idea of herd immunity has certainly become very attractive and widely misunderstood, but yet it's an incredibly powerful one. And very recently, the organized nature of the campaign for herd immunity has become very, very visible. It's emerged as, in the media, as a narrative of a schism in the scientific world, that there are scientists on both sides, that there's a difference of opinion. The fact that you have two groups of people from a community who seem to hold opposing views doesn't mean that the topic is contentious. You can get people to argue about anything. One of the advantages with science is that the ground truth is a bit easier to determine. Yet with all that we know about COVID-19, we've got people who are very strongly promoting this irresponsible and unethical herd immunity narrative and policy. But let's just imagine for a moment that herd immunity was possible, that indeed, through naturally acquired infection, we'd achieve herd immunity. It's just worth thinking how many people would need to be infected. And the more people that we have infected, the more deaths we'll have, right? So how many infections and how many deaths are acceptable for us to achieve herd immunity? If you're isolating or shielding the vulnerable section of your population, you may have as many as 30% of your population vulnerable. How are you going to support them? What are the costs of looking after the vulnerable? What are the costs that you will incur as the infection rips through the rest of the population? These are all substantial, and as has been very eloquently put by many, herd immunity is the goal. It's not the strategy. But there's something darker to this, because the proponents of herd immunity set up lockdown and restriction as a straw man. That the argument being made by those who are campaigning for a strategy that we think is scientifically based is for continuing lockdown. And that's absolutely not it. Lockdown is what we want to avoid. Going into lockdown means largely that we failed to do all the other things that would have allowed us to contain the infection, right? So lockdown is absolutely what everyone wants to avoid, but what we would like to have are other measures that we know work, widely implemented with clear communication and consistent messaging about them. The proponents of herd immunity talk at length about the consequences of lockdown on mental health, on health services, on other aspects of routine care, all of which are absolutely valid. However, it does seem a little disingenuous when these arguments come from people who have very long records in the public sphere of being vehemently opposed to improving support for healthcare services or welfare packages, or indeed any social welfare system that would actually allow people to survive situations precisely like this. And while they bemoan the cost that we've incurred to lockdown, there's no corresponding call for investment to actually deal with the costs that have already been incurred, only a concern about incurring further costs. This is, again, something else that should worry us, because why would we be thinking about any number of infections or deaths being acceptable, right? What we ought to be trying for is to minimize as much as possible. So the reason that this consensus letter was written was just to make clear that the science isn't contentious, and the science tells us very clearly what we need to do. And having fringe views like herd immunity out there are a distraction, but actually they're more dangerous than a distraction, because we're seeing these ideas being adopted by political parties, by governments, as a way to legitimize continuing inaction. Governments that have already followed policies that have failed are latching on to this particular narrative to continue not doing what needs to be done. Right? And of course, we've also learned recently that the people who are backing these campaigns are people who seem to be the likely suspects, people from right-wing think tanks, people by think tanks funded by the Koch brothers, the same sort of networks that were involved and are still involved in climate science denial. The goal here for all of us is to try and control the pandemic and try to get back to life as normal. We're going to continue to experience the impacts of both COVID-19 and the measures that we're going to have to take to try and combat COVID-19. Second time round, the thing we absolutely need to do is to make it worthwhile. Everything that we suffer, all the costs that we incur, they've got to be worthwhile, i.e., we need to emerge out of this having controlled the pandemic with the hope of getting back to life as normal. I understand it's a bit tricky when you see these alternative options or these different sides being presented in the media, and discussions about credibility, about hidden motivations. It's a bit difficult to see what exactly the hidden motivations are of a group of scientists and indeed several other healthcare professionals who are essentially saying, please, let's not have more people die, let's not have more people ill, let's not have any more people suffer the consequences of both this pandemic and what we're going to have to do to keep it in check to try and eliminate it. But just in case you're having doubts, just in case you're unsure, remember, there's always that golden rule of thumb. If you've got one side that seems to be saying it's okay, acceptable, sadly regrettable, but necessary that people must die, then you probably want to go with the other side. Okay, this here is Ali. Thank you.